Resuming debate?
Resuming debate.
Resuming debate.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the 2026 run of the Resuming Debate podcast. I'm your host, MP Genuis. We've had a bit of a slow start this year, obviously, but I'm excited now that we have a great series of guests identified for the weeks ahead. For those who are new to this, we publish this podcast about every 2 weeks, and we'll be doing so for the rest of the spring session, unless a Canadian election intervenes. Many of our guests, as you know, if you're a regular listener, come on to share up-to-the-minute thoughts on Canadian political stories, but I also like to bring in guests who can help inform our thinking about policy and politics from a little bit more of a theoretical and kind of upstream spot. So for today, I'm really excited to be talking to the author of a standout item from my Christmas reading list. This is author Leah Libresco Sargeant. The book is The Dignity of Dependence, a Feminist Manifesto. If you're watching the video version, I'm holding it up. Leah, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me on.
So I'm going to start by recommending that people buy and read this book. I was disappointed that I couldn't find it on Audible. That's my one objection here. I've got 6 kids, so I end up driving them places and consuming a lot of books that way. But I was so interested in your thesis that I bought a physical copy. And I wanted to start by probing one aspect of the title of the book. You've called it a Feminist Manifesto. And in politics, we have a lot of back and forth about what the word feminist means, who gets to use it, who doesn't. I wonder if you could share a bit about what is feminist in particular, about the arguments you make in the book, and why it was important to you to use the word feminist in a context where those arguments would maybe be viewed as heterodox by some in the feminist community.
Sure. I think it's helpful to put forward what I'm defining as feminism, which obviously is always a contested definition, even within people who all agree that they are feminists. My definition is that feminism is a movement that's deeply concerned with rendering justice to women as women. And the reason I add that as women is I mean that in contrast to seeing women as either defective men or as generic unsexed human beings. And one of the core claims of my book is that we make a real mistake if we think that the equal dignity of men and women is premised on men and women being fully interchangeable. That makes us nervous about acknowledging real biological differences between them, makes it harder to treat women fairly, and puts a lot of pressure on women to try and disguise those differences when they come up.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Why the word feminism? Why? I mean, with that language being politically charged, what would inform the decision to kind of present it and market it that way?
I'd say 2 things. One, in that I want to be honest. I am really grateful for some of the gifts I've received, both politically and philosophically, from the long argument that has been feminism. And I think I should be straightforward about that. And I think the other thing is that there's something in the title of this book to alienate almost any potential reader. I got pushback on the word dignity for being too Catholic, on the word dependence from people across the political spectrum of, can't it be interdependence? Can't we focus on what we give to each other? When the crux of my book is that there are periods where you will be genuinely dependent, not really paying people back, and we have to reckon with those parts of life. And kind of the hesitation to use the word dependence, it's too stark, it's too offensive, speaks to why I'm writing the book. And feminist certainly, worries some readers, but I also meant it to be an open door for readers who are a lot more skeptical of my position on abortion, but are curious why I identify as a feminist and where we do have substantial agreement on how to be attentive to women's distinct needs. And I think manifesto is just a warning to everyone in general.
Yeah, no, and I appreciate the desire to be sort of provocative to everyone, because you're writing this in a climate of intensifying polarization. I mean, I think it's true everywhere. It's particularly true in the United States. So in a way, it kind of provokes and challenges people who would want to identify in almost any category. So yeah, that's why I think that's one good reason why people, regardless of their existing philosophical commitments, can get a lot out of it. I think part of the context in which that kind of idea enters the conversation is that we are seeing growing ranks of sort of more explicit anti-feminist commentary. You debated one such person famously on Ross Douthat's podcast, to sort of identify that argument, these are critics that argue that women or that forms of feminism have had a negative impact on the workplace or on society in general. They identify women's presence in these institutions as a source of wokeism. Your argument is effectively to say that the problems aren't that society has become too feminized, it's actually that society hasn't become feminized enough. And that in particular, while workplaces maybe include more women, workplaces and other environments kind of, as you said, impose on women this need to adapt to male identity. What do you think about this kind of rise in explicit anti-feminist thinking, and to just put a fine point on what aspects you think they get wrong?
Yeah, I would say that the workplace isn't humane enough in that it treats people or aspires to treat people as though they're interchangeable cogs that don't fail, don't have needs, don't have relationships outside of work. And that's bad for men and women, but for women, it's unendurable faster. Women are kind of the canary in the coal mine of, are you setting up a workplace? Are you setting up a society that allows you to have relationships of dependency with other people who need you? Because pregnancy is very different than some of the other relationships that men have. But in both cases, if you can't take a day off work to care for someone who's sick, that's hard on men and on women. It just hits women harder. With regard to some of these different anti-feminist critiques, I think sometimes at their best, they're responding to a strain in feminism that I also reject, which is placing autonomy at the center of what we understand it means to be human. A lot of pro-choice advocacy starts its philosophical argument from the idea of a baby takes away a woman's chance to author her own future by interpolating this intruder who has different demands, who makes her sick, who limits what she can do. And if she's not actively willing this is unfair. And it's doubly unfair because it compromises the woman's autonomy, while at the same time, the baby is manifestly not autonomous. It needs her. It needs her intimately, and that need can't be answered by any other person till delivery. That's a strain of feminism that certainly exists, and which I think can't ultimately serve women well. Leave babies aside completely, because everyone will have periods where they fall short of this false image of autonomy, and it leads us to conclude that we're not fully human or we're failing as human beings in those periods. So that's where I'm in agreement with some of the critiques. Where I'm in disagreement, however, is first of all, the kind of desire to take the errors of the feminist movement to write off the genuine rooted critiques, especially of the early first and second wave feminist movement. That these were women responding to real injustices, political and social injustices that didn't leave mothers room to flourish at home or in the workplace. And part of the goal, I think, is the more you have concerns about where feminism ended up, the greater your responsibility to try and figure out, well, what in my own worldview could have responded to these unfairnesses and injustices better? How did my side fall down on the job here? And how can I make a credible pitch to mainstream feminists that we won't fall into those old errors, even as I try and repudiate new errors? And I think there's a strain of kind of anti-feminism that's looking for an excuse to not have real dialogues with people. I think it's important to remember that when you're on the other side of a contentious issue, even a life or death issue like abortion, people are on the other side because they have a concern for justice, even if it's a misapplied one. And kind of framing the feminist movement as, rooted in hatred of children, of contempt for men is, first of all, just descriptively untrue. And many people will tap out of conversation with you when you misunderstand them that badly. I think it helps more to say, okay, I think we're in disagreement because you are concerned with justice in a particular context, and you're letting that question eclipse other needs and other claims to justice or protection. Let's talk about these conflicting goals.
Mm-hmm. So to summarize, I mean, is it fair to say that you're saying feminism, as it's often understood or explained, has taken some wrong turns, but it also still has work that needs to be done. It's not just that there were past injustices that needed to be remedied by first and second wave feminism, but that there are enduring injustices impacting women that require feminism, that require a feminist critique, even if that feminist critique might not be, in your view, the same as you would get at a typical gender studies program.
Yes, and I think you always want to find what's best in your opponent and get them to lean into that, which may draw them onwards to a different ideology rather than repudiate only what's bad.
Yeah, so I said during my kind of earlier question that part of your argument is that there is a sense in which workplaces have not incorporated enough the feminine genius, and you said, well, it's really that they're not humane enough. And so in your book, you've got these two strands. One is talking about feminism, the other is talking about dependence. But obviously, there's a link between the two. Why is it that it seems that it is the presence of women in certain environments that drives them to be more humane? Why can't men be a voice of that humanity in those environments? Why weren't they previously?
I think partly it's that, men find it easier to make certain unjust compromises, especially because in family life, you might assume your wife is going to, take the day off of work when your kid has strep, figure things out, and therefore you're able to navigate demands that are kind of totalizing at work, even when they're not just, because you've got this kind of division of labor within your home about, well, who's going to buck this demand? I think also there's a real extent, I've kind of framed some of my conversation around this with, if you're pretending to be autonomous and you're not, when do you get caught and how? And for women, I think that experience of feeling like you've been exposed as not a full human being in this autonomous sense comes a lot earlier, both internally and externally. That because women, and only women can get pregnant, there's a sense of, wow, whatever else is going on in my life, there's a possibility for my life to change in this huge, intimate way, even before the baby is born, a way that I don't have full control or authorship over. And therefore, I've got to approach a lot of questions in my life in a way where I'm trying to leave room for that uncertainty, that precarity. And for men, there are definitely moments that can really destabilize your sense of, well, my body is my tool. It serves my will. It's strong enough for whatever I need to ask of it. But those will more often come through injury or illness, and they're rarer, versus for women, the sense of I'm exposed is a much more universal feeling.
I'll share a story with you from an environment that I know well that that does seem to reinforce an aspect of this historically. So my father is a physician and my wife is a physician, and obviously difference in gender, but also there's far more women in medicine at the time when my wife went through her training, and the kind of culture around you kind of work these extended through the night shifts, and then you're expected to go in the next day. Was much more intense during the years of my dad's training than my wife's training, and I think this is part of a lot of what people say is that how the presence of women in the workplace has pushed a more kind of human work-life balance, and I think it's evident in medicine, it's evident in other fields, and yet obviously men and patients benefit from this too, right? It was never good for patients that somebody was working 48 hours straight or something crazy just because they didn't want to be the one that said they couldn't do it. So it's kind of interesting how what you're describing. I mean, you're kind of making a theoretical argument, but it does seem to be very true historically that a more human structure of the workplace has been driven by conversations that women are seen as leading.
And I think there's been real benefits for men too, because when we look at time use surveys, which are maybe the most unromantic way to look at marriage and parenting, but they give you a nice lens into what everyone is doing. Men are the most engaged in parenting and childcare that they've ever been in all the years we've run these surveys. Men have really gained a lot more room to be active at home, to lead their families in this ways, to be engaged with their kids during their youngest years. And I think increasing workplace flexibility helps with that. And kind of the apolitical way we're getting there also, besides advocacy for women as women, is just that during COVID, there was such strong pressure to reset what the norms of the workplace looked like because people couldn't go into work for a while. And that forced everyone to reevaluate, all right, well, what is the best or necessary balance for this job? Is it 5 days a week in the office? For my own job, I'm 2 days a week in the office and 3 days at home. And it's interesting, work from home is one of the clearest effects of increasing fertility for women of almost any policy you could try, because the rewards of parenthood are greater when you get to spend more time with your kids.
Hmm. I want to circle back to the policy question in a little bit, because figuring out what the takeaways are is I think a really important part of this conversation. But I want to ask you another theoretical question. So one underlying kind of distinction of worldview that I was thinking about as I was reading your book is kind of a Marxist informed class warfare mentality, and a kind of Catholic social teaching common good orientation. What I mean is, so in Marxism, distinctions of class, but by extension other demographic distinctions, are often seen as vectors of conflict, and so you have conflict between workers and managers, between men and women, between different ethnic groups, and an attention to the good of one is seen as sort of in conflict with the good of the other. I think your way of thinking and talking is informed more by this this kind of common good orientation, which says there are different characteristics of different groups, in this case men and women, that they can bring into society as gifts that serve the common good. So your version of feminism is also good for men, instead of being about defending the interests of women against men. Do you think that's a fair distinction to make between maybe the way you're approaching the question and maybe the question is approached by some others?
Yeah, I think there are cases where a zero-sum analysis is appropriate, but this really isn't one of them. Including just at the very basic level, I work in my day job in family policy, and they're sometimes like, well, if we do things for families, are we disadvantaging others? And at the most basic level, if you do things for families, that's always going to be a universal policy win, because everyone begins their life as a baby, whether you go on to have kids or not. When we're working on family policy, we're working on policy that touches and helps every single person, because everyone begins their life born into a family. And in this case, I really don't think women have a tough time just because men are actively holding us down, or everything we want to win comes at men's expense. I don't even think bosses have a big plan to exploit workers constantly. I think people can be thoughtless about the compromises they're not personally enduring, and slow to adopt changes if they don't see them modeled as successful elsewhere. But I really don't ever assume malice when just slow-moving information diffusion will do.
In terms of this question of zero-sum games, is one of the trade-offs we have to make one around GDP? Like, do you think that the intensive setting of GDP growth as kind of the goal of society contributes to poor decision making around work-life balance, family policy, or do you think that a better balance could actually contribute to economic growth as well?
Well, based on the fertility track lines we're on, if you're really concerned with GDP, you have to be concerned with family policy, because countries that are contracting in population would have a very hard time growing their economy and certainly in sustaining their social welfare policies. So I don't think an over-attentiveness to GDP is leading us here. A narrow attentiveness could be. Where I think we're closest to having zero-sum trade-offs, where people really are fighting over a limited pot of money, is when we talk about how do we support families within the structure of our tax code. Because when you look at government spending, although you can go into deficit spending, and we do, there's still a finite pot of money that people are willing to spend without paying for it. So you do have those trade-offs of, well, in my state budget, in my local budget, at that federal level, what do I think I can spend on families that will have a really good return on investment for them and for the country as a whole? And do I believe that's important enough to displace other policies I want, like subsidizing auto loans or subsidizing seniors' property taxes? And there you get more of the bare knuckle brawling of, we understand this package is only getting so big, so who's getting pushed out?
Yeah. So on those fiscal policy aspects, there's a short-term pressure. I suppose you could still argue that policies that make it easier for families, if they contribute to higher levels of fertility, these are the things that actually allow us to, for instance, do more for seniors, right? If you have a society that has a smaller number of working people relative to those who are retired, it necessarily follows that you can afford to do less for those that are retired.
That's true, though I want to be upfront. I think we should support families more as a matter of justice. I think we'll produce modest fertility gains, but I don't think it's going to turn around completely the kind of demographic pressures we're under in the timeline we would need to turn them around. I think it's
Yeah.
always a mix of government policy and, fiscal help, which does a little for families and fertility, and cultural change, which does a lot more.
Yeah. What does it say about our culture and our politics that we tend to be drawn into zero-sum thinking, especially as it relates to gender? It does seem pretty prominent in the discourse around gender that that there is that the discussion is defined by a kind of zero-sum thinking.
I think it's always sort of psychologically a relief to imagine there's a powerful villain or a conspiracy that has taken something from you that doesn't belong to them, and that once you wrest it out of their hands, things will be okay again. And I think the reason it's comforting is it implies the world is fundamentally easy to arrange justice in, except for these bad actors obstructing it. And one of the reasons I don't find it that compelling is justice is hard. Justice is complicated. Trying to figure out how people's conflicting needs fit together is hard. So I don't usually think, well, there's just this small group of people with ill-gotten gains or with active animus towards women, and once we beat them, politics will be easy. Politics will always continue to be complicated and will always involve, both kind of fiscal and philosophical questions of what we owe to each other and how we render it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I suppose in the narratives we use for politics, it's easier to think in terms of these zero-sum games. Although I think many people appreciate hearing the message that actually we can do better for everybody in society. Let's dive into the issue of dependence, because this is a core aspect of your book that people are kind of that our cultures are defined by too much of a sense of atomization, of autonomy, and that we would be better off accepting, recognizing our dependence on others. What does that concept of dependence mean to you, and how should people maybe think about living differently in their day-to-day, taking this concept on board?
I think the big idea is that we are fundamentally, as human beings, characterized by our need for other people. And the intensity of that need will vary in our lives. The extent to which we're interdependent and paying back or not will vary. But what's fundamental is that we can't live on our own, and that our beginning of our lives are marked by profound dependence. For most of us, the end of our life is marked by a period of profound dependence. And those intense periods of reliance on others are dappled all through the middle. And so you really face a choice. If you think about all those periods, beginning of life, end of life, periods of illness, pregnancy, injury, etc., as fundamentally constituting an interruption or a betrayal of your real human life as an autonomous individual, it's very hard to figure out what it means to live well in those periods. And I think it does drive a lot of the attraction to euthanasia, which I know is a ever-growing share of deaths in your country, because there's a sense of, well, this period of becoming older isn't part of a real human life. It's an interruption or betrayal of it. So I don't want it. I don't want these people. I don't think this counts. I don't think there's any way to constitute a good human life here. And I think for a lot of folks, this kind of rhetoric or assumption goes unquestioned when you frame it as around a narrow range of people, children in the womb, elderly with terminal illnesses. But once you start from the premise that periods of profound dependency kind of push you out of the human family, it's very hard to figure out who you get to keep in the human family.
Mm-hmm. So the distinction is for a lot of our culture, the message is real life is autonomy, and you're saying no, real life is dependence. That is
Yes.
the natural, normal, healthy state of being.
And even in your periods of strength, a lot of what you do will be constrained by the relationships of love that you form with other people who are in their periods of greater dependence, and how that confines what you can choose or what you can take on, giving your continuing obligations to them.
Mm-hmm. Is part of the argument as well that embracing this reality of dependence creates and reinforces bonds of community. That there are maybe situations where, you know, if we've just had a baby, we can line up the Uber Eats for 2 weeks and we can afford to do that. But something is lost in terms of community if we tell our friends, no, don't worry about it, we've got the Uber Eats coming, versus saying, yes, please bring us a meal. We'd appreciate your help.
Yes, and not only do you kind of lose out on the personal touch, of just people are bringing me specific meals that I know they love, rather than just things I order from strangers. I think you also lose out on kind of what's core to the witness of friendship, which is friends are people who see you when you're not presentable, when you're not professional, who aren't just handing off food at the door, but see that because you're sick, because you've had a baby, your house is messy, and you get the witness that they love you anyway. And the more you kind of push off as much as you can, if you can afford to, these relationships of care, of caretaking dependence into, well, I have paid help from strangers, you're not getting that associated witness of my friends come and see me when I'm sick, when I'm weak, when I'm injured, because they love me, not just because I compensate them.
Mm-hmm. Bringing that back into the gender discussion, do you think men, for cultural reasons perhaps or other reasons, have a harder time presenting as vulnerable? Is that part of why this idea of dependence is something that women are more likely to bring into the collective conversation?
Yes, I think there's a lot of both there's a lot of both stigma and kind of lack of scripts for what does it mean for a man to need things from other people. And I think part of what falls apart there is not just a sense of, well, a man is untouchable, he's always strong enough for whatever is going on. We lack a lot of habits that used to exist historically of men taking on tasks that were obviously larger than themselves. When you just even look at a classical example like barn raising, where a man's conception of himself would not be, I am strong enough to do everything my family needs of me by myself, but I am active enough, responsible enough to be part of endeavors that are larger than any one of us, that rely on our mutual dependence to raise this barn. I think the more that you think of a lot of your accomplishments or experiences of your own strength as coming through purely solo activities, then the harder it is to navigate, I have something I'm responsible for that I can't discharge fully by myself. Versus if your whole community expects, everyone has some of those, and often the men all get together to do them, and they don't all contribute equally because some of them are stronger than others, but they are all part of discharging this responsibility. The easier it is not to be surprised that you won't be strong enough for every single thing you're responsible for in your life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I do think your analysis of dependence, it speaks really well to some of the challenges that men actually disproportionately face in our society, challenges that are associated with isolation. And I don't think that's sort of natural or inevitable. I think it's very masculine to have lots of friends and to be there for your friends and to ask your friends to be there for you. But it does seem like some of the cultural forms we've come to hold up for whatever reason kind of move us away from that sense of men and women living in community.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I'll share a personal story with you about like something that from this book for me. I got a lot out of thinking about dependence in my own life. And just like one vignette that kind of stuck out at me. I had just read your book and I was with my kids and I was like, in Toronto. We were trying to get them on a train, and it was crowded. And I said, you know what? I'm part of a community, and I asked this like random young man, "Hey, can you help me get this stroller on the train?" Right? This is like very small and trivial, but it's like not something I normally would have done. And he was happy to help. And then I remember looking back and seeing that he had kind of a neutral expression before, and he was smiling afterwards. And I was like, oh, maybe. And as I thought about your thesis and some of these ideas around community, that that he probably got something out of feeling like he was part of a community as well, right? And getting asked for help, just as it made my life easier as well. So these like little interactions that maybe seem very trivial, but accumulated, they can move us towards being a different kind of community especially than in big cities we often are.
And when you look at, men who are depressed, men who are isolated, men who consider suicide, a lot of them talk about as a big part of what leads them there, the sense of, I'm not necessary to anyone. I can contemplate ending my own life because there won't be a missing space where I was. People don't need me. They won't miss me. I'm mostly a burden, or I'm mostly irrelevant. And being really knit into a community, so you can think, every day, every week, I am needed in some way. I lifted that stroller on, I shoveled out this neighbor's yard, I brought something over, I lifted this thing, I talked to someone, helps create a sense of, well, obviously there would be a missing space without me. And I think for young men, especially, when you think about those kind of middle school health chats where it's like, your body is changing, you are growing hair in new places. It's kind of mostly framed as bad things are happening to you. But part of what happens for young men is they get a lot stronger. Those kind of gender disparities of what you can lift, how far you can run, open up in a bigger way. And I think our culture does a really poor job answering, well, what is all this strength for? You're getting bigger and stronger in a way that you weren't before. Your life isn't changing that much to keep up with it. So why do you have these physical gifts, and who are you meant to put them at the service of?
Right. Yeah. So again, this is back to the idea of the common good, of us needing each other, of us as human beings. We all have differences, and those differences can be a source of gift to the common good. And not every man is interchangeable with other men. Same with women. We're parts of communities that bring different gifts, and we are all needed. And that's a source of understanding our value, which is to push back against this ultra autonomist model of existence. Let's talk a bit about policy. So kind of 1,000-foot level, you become president in 2028. Your first action, of course, will be to cancel all tariffs on Canada. But after that, what are we'll come back to some of the social issues, especially euthanasia, but in the area of kind of economic, tax policy, labor force policy, what are the changes that you would bring about at a national policy level in your country to try to try to give practical life to some of these ideas you've talked about?
So let me raise kind of some very family focused ones, and then one broader affordability one, which is, I would have national paid family medical leave after the birth of a child, which we don't have in my country, paid for through a payroll tax, so that you have a broad tax base for supplying this benefit and are giving dads, let's say, 6 weeks to 3 months. I'll hammer out the details with the tax lawyers for dads, and 3 months to 6 months for moms. And I would do it with that gender gap, because what moms and dads do after birth is different. So payroll tax sponsored family medical leave. Boom. Second thing, a baby bonus for families. So after you have a baby, you get a check for $2,000 that comes to you right with their national Social Security card. And that's so that families can navigate that big financial hit they take, not just from buying diapers, but for many of them, scaling back work, disruptions to what they do, hospital bills, and just merely smooth out that gap between income and expenses that hits particularly hard the first year. And also probably up the amount of our child tax credit for young families who are navigating childcare costs in particular, and that it can taper back to its normal level when kids are older and families are further along in their career, so that they can rely a little more on their own earnings and savings versus that extra support. That's all very directly family benefits focused. The other big policy is I want to drive down housing costs, which benefits families and everyone else. In America, we have a big gap between our demand for housing and our supply of housing. And you don't need to be a Nobel Prize winning economist to know that when you aren't meeting consumer demand for something, the price is going to go up. So if we can just build the amount of housing that our families actually need and close that supply gap, housing prices will go down. It needs to happen all across the country. It benefits families. It benefits everyone else, even folks who really value their current house, because it gives them more room to move and to not just treat their house as a savings vehicle, but as, something that allows them to be rooted in this community when it's right to do so, and maybe to downsize later in life to an affordable, cost-effective house when that makes more sense for their particular needs.
So it's interesting hearing these proposals and comparing them to some of the debates we're having in Canada. On the housing costs issue, this has been a big part of our national conversation. I think our housing prices in Canada are generally worse than yours, which, on the face of it, we're a rather large country. We've got about we've substantially fewer people and more land than you guys do. Of course, our population is concentrated, in certain pockets, but still, it's kind of on the face of it, like, why do we have such trouble with housing costs? And a lot of it is that we're not building fast enough. So incentives around the construction of more homes has been a big part of the political conversation. I guess the other side to that, though, is that there are cultures in which kind of intergenerational shared housing is more common. So family formation is much more challenging in our culture when it's sort of expected that you go out and live on your own when you get married and start having kids. In other cultures, that's less common. Do you think one possible individual response to this policy failure is more dependence, more intergenerational living? And is that a phenomenon you're seeing in the U.S.?
I think it's a possible response, and it's one I like. I think it's harder to do when housing supply is lower. So one of the reasons you want to increase the supply is bring down costs, make it easier for folks who want to live on their own as their family in a single family detached house to do it. But when there is more housing and when there's more churn in the market, these people aren't sitting in a panicked way on their low interest rates because they can't afford to buy it any other time, it's also easier to plan co-housing with friends or family because it's easier to find, let's say, a duplex. I think this is a particularly good model where you and another young family live side by side. You share meals some of the nights. And when one family is going out on a date, they have free babysitting because the other parents are watching the baby monitor from right next door. You might have a grandparent come stay with you. You might scale up or down depending on whether you're adding that bedroom or whether you're looking for a house with no stairs as your mom is getting older and you bring her in to live with you. But kind of every arrangement, whether it is a very nuclear family or a more co-housing family, is easier when you can find and afford the house that makes sense for you.
Yeah, that's a good point. That more housing, more construction lends itself to more flexibility and more accommodation to these kinds of options. So building homes, making homes accessible, that's a key policy priority. In terms of the policies you proposed around paid leave, baby bonus, and family tax credit, you have described these policies as not principally about incentivizing higher levels of fertility, but rather about justice for families. Could you explain that a bit more? Like, what is the principle of justice that obliges these kinds of policies?
Yeah, I think part of it is that we think about what a state is for. Why do we come together in politics to form a state? And it's often to protect certain fundamentals of our life together. We have a state so that we can have the ability to project military force to keep our state safe, right? That's one of the core functions. We do it so there can be a certain amount of coordination on shared spending like roads, something we all want and don't want to take up a collection for every time. Families are politically prior to the state. The family is the first natural human institution. So part of what a state should be concerned about is not just the preservation of itself, but the preservation of the family. And I think especially when you see, as you do in America, these gaps of how many kids women say they want versus how many they're getting to have. It's a gap of about half a child per woman. When you kind of see the birth rate going down, and that it's not going down because people are choosing and thrilled about other things, but they feel like they're missing out on this chance, then you have to ask, okay, well, is our state succeeding at its most basic functions? If our highway system started falling apart, we'd say something's going wrong with how we appropriate and spend money. If our families are falling apart, that's not all due to the state and our spending, but we've got to ask, well, where can we help a little bit here, and what else has to be done in the culture?
Mm-hmm. From the perspective of justice, I suppose you would hear from some people who say, well, I don't have any children. Why should I pay? I mean, I don't agree with these arguments selfishly as well as for substantive philosophical reasons. But I mean, what would your response be to someone who says these are programs that transfer financially from those without kids to those with kids, and how is that fair?
Yeah, my core argument for fairness is you were once a kid. Every policy that comes into existence doesn't automatically benefit those who existed prior to that policy, right? So, when you say this is a tax thing that happened in America that I don't really feel like a fan of, but we've adjusted how you can deduct racehorses from your taxes. And if you bought a racehorse last year, you're worse off than if you bought it this year. But we don't really regard that kind of claim to fairness as relevant. Of if you think you're improving tax law, the fact that it was worse for people prior doesn't make it bad to improve it now. When you have pro-family and pro-kid policies, every single person, as long as they're born, which every single person is at some point in their life at the very beginning, will benefit directly from these policies. You are guaranteed to benefit from a baby bonus as a baby. You are not guaranteed to receive Social Security because you could easily die before you're eligible. It's the most universal benefit you can have.
Mm-hmm. And I think my Canadian audience would be interested in your perspective on why paid leave hasn't happened in the U.S. Like it's even the length of leave you're proposing is actually less than what we already have in this country, and so I guess maybe a two-part question I'll ask is why, what are the political circumstances that have led to this not happening up to this point in the United States? And then secondly, it does seem, notwithstanding that I think birth rates are higher in the US than they are in many other Western developed countries that have more generous leave policies. So why do you think that has been the case, that relatively speaking, birth rates in the US have been relatively high despite in this aspect a less pro-family policy approach?
All right, so let me see if I can tackle all of those, and catch me if I miss one, right?
Sure.
First of all, why does paid leave stall out in the US? I would say there's kind of two political factors that have made it hard to get a victory. There has been progress at the state level. More states, including D.C., where I work and where I was working when I had my most recent baby, are offering some subsidized leave for everyone based on a payroll tax, but we don't scale that up nationally, and it's not happening in every state. And what I think has tended to stall it out are two factors. One, the US has a really high degree of respect for business owners and a very strong hesitance to burden them. And that's partly why just having kind of unfunded mandates for leave has been very politically tricky, versus we're going to have a broad-based payroll tax that creates a pool of money that pays out for leave is easier. The US has an unfunded mandate for unpaid leave, which still costs the employer something in losing employees, called Family Medical Leave Act, FMLA leave. And it gives moms and dads up to 12 weeks of leave, but it's all unpaid. And the US has specifically exempted every employer that has fewer than 50 employees from having to offer this leave at all. And as a result, only about half of parents are eligible for this unpaid leave in the first place. So I think it's just not possible to push for this to be expanded or to be universal unless you're attaching funds that don't come directly out of the employer's pocket. And I think that's being modeled pretty well on the state level. Now, the other big political hurdle is often once you open the door to parental leave, everyone else wants to rush through that door at the same time, and I don't blame them. So once you start debating, well, should we have a payroll tax? Should it subsidize parental leave? Well, should it also subsidize other forms of leave? Should it subsidize other medical leave? Should it subsidize leave for parents when the other parent is deployed? Should it subsidize leave to care for a relative who is dying? And I care a lot about how we handle each of those situations, but trying to do them all at once in one policy in the states that have tried it have usually resulted in the whole policy collapsing due to costs and lack of buy-in. The states that have succeeded have really focused on rolling out narrow policies of leave, proving it's sustainable, then returning to the question of whether expansion is possible, rather than trying to do everything on the first try. But not every state has been willing to make those compromises. Now, your other question was about fertility rates in America versus other countries. We do a lot less for parents than countries like the Nordics do, and yet our fertility is higher. And there I think it's helpful to think about kind of what the cost benefit of becoming a parent is. I think what the government does in these policies is it reduces the cost of having a kid. And I think that's a real help. And if you're thinking about parents thinking about, well, what do we want to take on? Reducing the cost always gets some parents off the fence and helps them take the plunge when otherwise it felt too risky. But I think the government does relatively little to kind of really change that benefit sense of what does it mean for us to have a kid? Why do we want a kid? What does it mean for our marriage? Because America is a much more religious country than the Nordics, you have a lot more people who are really attached to children for, senses of how they connect you to eternity, right? Like, I am trying to raise saints, in doing this, I'm receiving the gift of life directly from God, and I'm privileged to be a steward of this child. And so I think in America, you have parents coming in at baseline on average with a much stronger sense of what they gain from having a child, regardless if they get any help in making the attempt. So when the government removes cost barriers, that's a big help. But in countries where there's a more attenuated sense of what are children for, why do we desire them, you can remove some of those barriers without unlocking as much fertility because you don't have the cultural supports to make people want to take the plunge.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting and thought provoking. In just the time we have left, I want to shift to the subject of euthanasia or medical assistance in dying, as it's been named here in Canada. I thought a lot about that in the context of your arguments about dependence, because the initial arguments in favor of the legalization of euthanasia. And I just for context, I was elected in 2015, so I've kind of been in Parliament for the duration of this debate. When I was first elected, we had just had a Supreme Court decision calling for the opening of the door to some extent, but kind of it's been interesting to see how the conversation and the mentalities around this have changed over time. The initial arguments are usually about just brutal, unendurable pain. At the same time, a lot of the polling of people and conversations I've had with people say that the desire for this has something to do with autonomy or loss of autonomy. That there is a sense of self that people have that is tied to their ability to do things. In some cases, to do things without help, and I don't think that that's inevitable. I think that flows from a kind of social context in which people who are in positions of vulnerability are receiving messages about what is and is not dignified. You alluded to this debate earlier, but I'd love to get your thoughts on what on how the conversation around euthanasia can be informed by your take on dependence, on autonomy, on how human dignity persists in the midst of vulnerability.
Yeah, I think part of what really stands out is you're right that people kind of cite pain as the reason this needs to be legal when they're making the case for legalization. But in practice, once it's legal, people seeking euthanasia in America are much more likely to cite the fear of being a burden than they are to cite their actual experience of pain as a reason for requesting lethal drugs. And I think that's not just an objective, unfixable thing. It, has something to do with what we regard it to be human. And the more that we say, someone who's a good person doesn't ask too much of others. If they live a tidy life, they will never need too much. There's an embarrassing interlude as a baby where you do. But once you're a grown-up, grown-ups never should return to that state of profound dependence again. It creates kind of this glide path to destroying your life because you feel like you're no longer living a full and flourishing human life as defined by this ideal of autonomy. And I think what's particularly troubling, including some of the reports I've seen in Canada in particular, is it leads to essentially operating two suicide hotlines, where depending on which number you call, if you say, I don't think my life is worth living, I'm a burden to everyone around me, I don't want them to have to worry about taking care of me, I don't feel like things will get better. If you call the normal suicide hotline, people will say, that sounds like depression talking. Do you want to come in? Do you want to talk to someone about what your life looks like? No one is only a burden. That's not the way to think about what it means to be. People take care of you because they love you. Everyone needs things from each other. If you call the other hotline, they say, yeah, that sounds bad. We can help you. Like, you can be killed sometime in the next month. And those two claims can't both be true at the same time. You've got to sort out, are people who feel like they need too much from the people who love them, that it's unjust to be cared for by the people who love them, right or wrong? And any legal euthanasia regime says some people who think that are correct. They are better off dead. They are doing something bad to their families. And that's why the government is making this container for you to come and commit suicide.
Mm-hmm. So sometimes our politics are informed by this libertarian mentality that like more options always make the individual better off. I think part of what you're saying is that the option of something to someone in a certain situation, it's not just kind of a neutral option that they can dismiss if they're not interested, but the fact of that option being present impacts their experience in some way that makes them potentially worse off, even if they don't elect for that option.
Absolutely. You see that happen both kind of very explicitly when people, a number of stories like this in Canada who aren't seeking euthanasia in the first place, who are seeking a ramp to their house, because they use a wheelchair and they need it for mobility. They're on the waiting list for the ramp. And then while they're on the waiting list, someone says, we can't do the ramp on a timely way, but we definitely can have you killed. Is that something you're interested in? Proactively offering euthanasia, I think, is profoundly destructive, and we know it's happening. But beyond that,
yes,
it just is a testimony to this would be reasonable to want. If it feels like your life is hard, if it feels like you're asking a lot of other people, we, your government, your doctors, all think it would be reasonable for you to elect to kill yourself. So even without making that last explicit ask of, are you interested? Everything in the legal and medical regime says some people think it's kinder to stop living in your circumstances. And we think that's a great option for some people to pick. Are you in that bucket?
Yeah. This is a logical place for me to plug my private members bill that I've just tabled for those that haven't seen Bill C-260, the Care Not Coercion Act. And we're trying to prohibit people in positions of authority in most cases from raising MAID or euthanasia with those who haven't requested information about it first. Obviously, many people who share mine and your underlying philosophical commitments will see this not as a fulsome solution, but as a step. But I think it's an important step because a lot of the discourse around euthanasia has been about dignity and what message does it actually send to people who are seeking public services who have death proactively suggested to them. But I think your underlying point about dependence is that life is good and meaningful and beautiful in a situation where you need the help of others, because that is the natural and normal state of things. And people who need help also have a lot to give. People who need help with sort of routine physical tasks still have wisdom and life experience and things that they can share with their families. As a final question, could you talk a bit about the concept of dignity itself? We've talked about, we've gone through some of the words in the title. We've talked about feminist. We've talked about dependence. In Canada, a lot of the debate around euthanasia uses the framing of dignity or dying with dignity. Tell us about what dignity means to you, and why that was also an important concept to kind of include in the framing of your argument.
Yeah, I think dignity is about who we are as human beings, and whether it's good to be a human being as we actually are, or whether human beings are something flawed and sort of bad, but maybe one day we'll transcend that through technology, or we'll transcend that by killing the human beings who don't meet this standard. But for me, what's core about dignity is it's something about who you are, not about what you can do, not about your present capacities, that there is something good about being a human being, full stop. Now, this is obviously strongly informed by my being Catholic, that part of what is good about being a human being is that you are made in the image of likeness of God, and that God has loved you into being. And that this is kind of the ultimate relationship of dependence, that whatever we can do for each other to try and pay back what we receive, this is the ultimate relationship where we are loved without any hope of recompensing the one who loves us in kind or in proportion. And yet it is all right to be loved in this way. You don't have to agree with me on that kind of full theological argument to be interested in the question of dignity. But I think it's helpful for everyone to ask, well, where are you citing this dignity? Is it in your being, in who you are, or is it in your doing, in what you can presently achieve?
Yeah, I talk about my political philosophy as Christian informed humanism, right? Like the practical outworking of my faith in politics is humanism. It's a belief that human beings have inherent dignity and value. Now, for me, there's a particular derivation of that, but hopefully there's space to build political coalitions among people who may not share all of those particulars, but who understand, like the humanism you're describing is one that values human beings as they are, not as the potential to change aspects about themselves, to adapt to hostile environments, or to present themselves as more autonomous than they are, but to value human beings as human beings in all of their uniqueness and with whatever natural limitations come with the human experience.
That's right.
So, everyone, read the book. And any final words you want to share before we sign off? Anything I missed or should have asked you?
I like some of the policy we talked through, but if people are looking for something they can do in their everyday life, I would say find a reason to ask a friend for help in the next 2 weeks. That a lot of these habits of asking for help and giving help have broken down. If you want to rebuild them, you have to start by asking, because that's the more humiliating side of the relationship to be on. And when you do that, it makes it a lot easier for your friends when they're in need to think of asking you, because you've shown you're someone who thinks this is allowed.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you for that advice. I think that's good advice, and it's something that I tried to do after reading your book, and it was hard, but it was good as well. So this has been the Resuming Debate podcast with our guest Leah Libresco Sargeant, and we'll be back again with another episode in 2 weeks.